Welcome back to Spill the Sauce, a Sunday Table podcast. I'm Maria. Before we get into today's conversation, I want to share a few quick updates. Spill the Sauce now has a home on Patreon, and that's where you'll find Antipasti, my Patreon-only mini show, which goes live every Wednesday. For Patreon listeners, new Spill the Sauce episodes are available early on Fridays before going live everywhere else on Sundays. Also on Patreon, we'll be doing some live Q&As and one live chat a month. It's a quieter, more conversational space to connect beyond the episodes. Another small but meaningful thing, when you do subscribe on Patreon, I'll be reading supporter names out loud on the following episode. It's just a way to say thank you and acknowledge the people helping keep this table set. There's absolutely no pressure. The table stays open either way. But if you've been asking how to support the podcast or listen early, Patreon is where you can do that. And of course, we're still welcoming your stories. If you have a tradition, a food, a moment that stayed with you, something you've been carrying with you without knowing why, you're welcome to send it to sundaytablepodcast@gmail.com. And, this podcast is built around shared experiences, and there's always room for more voices at the Sunday table. So, my voice is a little bit crackly today. I'm a little bit sick. This is also going to be another solo episode. We have a very special episode next week. And then after that, we are going to take a mid-season break. And there will be a surprise for episode 7. And I'll be discussing what the surprise is in this week's Antipasti episode. So if you're not a subscriber on Patreon, I suggest that you head over there after you hear this episode and get to it so you can find out what the surprise is. This episode was not originally planned for today. But I'm a human first. And I can't talk about telling your story or my story or their story. And I can't talk about telling your story without losing yourself if I ignore what's happening around us right now. Especially when it's happening in our own backyard. One of the first things my parents taught me was to love people. That's what my church taught me too. I learned about the Jesus who flipped tables, who challenged power and leaders, who didn't confuse kindness with silence. I was raised to believe that a person's worth isn't measured by the color of their skin, but by their character. And what I'm seeing right now from our institutions and from people in our own communities is deeply out of alignment with that. So today's episode is still about storytelling. But it's also about memory, responsibility, and what happens when we forget who and where we come from. I want to talk for a moment about what's happening right now because this isn't theoretical for me. Just over this past weekend, this first weekend of February, ICE was active in my hometown in Jersey City and Hoboken. It wasn't somewhere far away from me like Minnesota, somewhere I've never been before. No, this was literally where I grew up, where I know people. And these were the streets I walked, the community I grew up in. And what stopped me dead in my tracks was seeing that video on Instagram and hearing that ICE officer who told the local council member that they do not need a warrant, to forget about a warrant, that they need to get that out of their head. Just sitting with that for a second, a federal agency telling an elected official that they don't need judicial oversight. And whether you want to debate the legality or not, the reality is that this is how power announces itself, right? And it should make all of us uncomfortable. At the same time, we're watching U.S. citizens being harmed and even killed. For what? For what? Alex Pretty was literally helping a woman stand back up after being pushed down by an ICE officer. For trying to help. For trying to step in. For acting out of basic human decency. They weren't criminals. They weren't committing violence. They were people helping. And you can debate that. You most absolutely can debate that. And you are most certainly allowed to have your own opinions on it. I'm just stating the facts of what was witnessed, of what I saw with my own two eyes. And the fact that this isn't stopping us in our tracks says a lot about how numb we've become. What's been just as disturbing is how quickly this kind of behavior is being normalized. I keep hearing phrases like, that's just the law, or they should have done it the right way, or they shouldn't be standing there, they shouldn't have interfered. As if repeating those lines absolves us, me and you, from asking harder questions. When did we decide that legality automatically equals morality? When did we stop interrogating systems simply because they wear the costume of authority? And then there's the part that honestly breaks my heart the most. Watching people from my own community, watching Italians cheer this on, rooting for the deportations, mocking the fear, acting as if this couldn't possibly touch them or their families. And I find myself just sitting here thinking like, are you friggin' serious? Because the way immigrants are being treated today is exactly how their ancestors were treated. One wrong move, one accusation, one shift in political mood, and you were gone. Whether people want to claim that their families came here legally, and I put that in air quotes, or not, the truth is that the system everyone's invoking today did not exist the way they imagined that it did. And this isn't abstract for me. This is happening where I live. This is happening where I grew up. And what makes all of this so painful is that none of this is new. We've seen this before. The only thing that's changed are the names being targeted and who's pretending not to remember. There's a phrase I keep hearing over and over again whenever immigration comes up. My family did it the right way. And every time I hear that, I realize how deeply misunderstood our own history has become. Because the truth is, the idea of legal versus illegal immigration, the way people talk about it today, did not exist when most of our ancestors arrived in this country. There were no visas. There were no numerical quotas. There were no elaborate framework deciding who was worthy and who was not. You showed up a lot through Ellis Island. You found work. You survived. That was it. You know, and people love to project modern systems backward in time. as if their great grandparents or grandparents navigated the same rules we're arguing about today, about now. They didn't. These systems simply weren't there. They didn't exist. What did exist was exploitation, dangerous labor, poverty, discrimination, and the constant threat of removal if you became inconvenient. And then, in 1924, everything changed. The Immigration Act of 1924 fundamentally reshaped who was allowed to come to the United States. It imposed strict quotas based on national origin. Quotas that overwhelmingly targeted Southern and Eastern Europeans, including Italians, Slavs, and Jews. Immigration from these regions was sharply restricted, not because people stopped needing work or safety, but because the country decided certain groups were no longer desirable. And those restrictions didn't quietly fade away. No. They remained in place for decades, well into the 1960s. So, when people talk about waiting your turn or doing it the right way, what they're really ignoring is this. For a long time, there was no line for many people. The door was intentionally shut. Modern immigration laws didn't emerge because America suddenly discovered order. They emerged after the country was already built, largely to control who could come, not whether immigration itself should happen. America was already built when these laws were created. And they were created largely to keep certain people out. And that's the part people forget. Or maybe pretend not to know. When they invoke our ancestors to justify cruelty today. And I want to be clear about something. I'm not sharing this to shame anyone. I'm sharing all of this because forgetting this history has consequences. And that brings me back to today. I'm recording this on Tuesday, February 3rd. It's the beginning of February. We just entered Black History Month. And every single year, without fail, I watch the same reaction play out. I see people, and yes, I'm talking about Italians amongst others, saying things like, what about Italian History Month? And I want to say this as clearly and as calmly as I can. We have Italian History Month. It's in October. So that reaction isn't about being erased. It's about being uncomfortable with attention being placed somewhere else. Black History Month is not an attack on anyone's identity. It's not a subtraction. It's an invitation. An invitation to learn history that was intentionally left out of our classrooms. History that is not just filled with pain, but with brilliance, resistance, creativity, leadership, and beauty. And that history isn't separate from American history. It is American history. But many of us weren't taught that. We were taught fragments, a few names, a few dates, a few sanitized moments that made the story easier to swallow and easier to forget. What we weren't taught was the depth, the organizing, the culture, the intellectual work, the daily survival that built this country while being denied full humanity within it. So when people respond to Black History Month with defensiveness or comparison, it tells me something important. Not that they know too much, but that they were never taught enough. And here's the thing. This isn't a competition for suffering. It's a chance to learn. A chance to expand our understanding of this country. A chance to see how deeply interconnected our histories actually are, whether we are taught that or not. You know, because there's another piece of history that almost never gets talked about. And that's the long, complicated history of Italian and Black communities standing alongside each other in this country. Because despite what some people like to believe now, Italians and Black Americans did not arrive here as enemies. They arrived as people trying to survive. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Italian immigrants and Black Americans often worked side by side in the most dangerous, exhausting, and lowest paid jobs in this country. And I'm talking railroads, docks, mines, construction sites, steel mills. These were jobs that destroyed bodies and shortened lives. And they were jobs that white employers didn't want and didn't want to protect. Employers intentionally hired Italian and Black workers together because neither group had legal protection, political power, or social standing. Simply put, they were exploitable, replaceable, disposable. But what employers didn't count on was what happens when people who are being crushed in the same way start talking to each other. That shared reality led to cross-racial organizing. And this is especially true in labor movements that rejected segregation outright. The industrial workers of the world, the IWW, openly organized Black workers, Italian workers, and other immigrants together at a time when most unions were strictly segregated. They went on strike together. They faced violence together. And they terrified employers because solidarity is dangerous to people who profit from division. And that solidarity didn't just exist at work, it existed at home. In cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and even New Orleans. Italian immigrants and Black Americans lived in adjacent and often overlapping neighborhoods. Before East Harlem became predominantly Black and Puerto Rican, Italian and Black families lived block by block. They shared schools, street markets, churches, and informal networks of care. Oral histories tell us that neighbors watched each other's children while parents worked brutal hours. Food was shared, housing was shared, credit was extended when banks refused to lend, because neither community could rely on these institutions. Banks excluded them, hospitals turned them away, government services were limited or outright denied. So, they built their own safety nets together. And then there's culture, especially music. Early jazz scenes in New Orleans, Chicago, and Harlem included Italian-American musicians playing alongside Black musicians. This wasn't social equality. Segregation was still very real. But music became one of those few spaces where interracial collaboration could exist without immediate violence. This wasn't appropriation, it was proximity. Learning from each other, playing together, acknowledging shared roots and shared struggle at a time when doing so was risky. And it's important to say this clearly. Italians were not immune to racial terror. In 1891, 11 Italian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans, one of the largest mass lynchings in U.S. history. That moment exposed a truth people are uncomfortable with now. Italians were not yet considered white. Many Black leaders recognized that shared vulnerability. Some Italian community leaders later supported anti-lynching efforts that were primarily led by Black activists. But over time, something shifted. As Italians were offered conditional whiteness, partial acceptance, limited protection, solidarity became more dangerous than separation. Division didn't happen naturally. It was introduced intentionally by politicians, police, and employers who benefited from keeping poor communities apart. And something powerful was lost. The alliance didn't fail because it wasn't real. It failed because power intervened. When Italians and Black Americans were allowed proximity, they worked together, organized together, and survived together. And that history matters because it proves that what we're seeing now is not inevitable. I want to be honest about something, because pretending otherwise would be another form of self-erasure. I am tired. I'm tired of having to explain basic history to adults. Tired of having to walk people step by step through realities that are easily accessible if they actually wanted to know. I'm tired of watching conversations about identity get reduced to jokes. You know, there's more to life, there's more to being Italian than gravy versus sauce, cannoli or sfogliatelle, spaghetti and meatballs versus regional cooking, as if that's the full extent of who we are. Food is culture, absolutely. But it's not the whole culture. Not in America. So, when identity gets flattened into aesthetics, it becomes easy to ignore the history underneath it. The struggle, the survival, the solidarity. And it becomes especially easy to cheer harm when you've disconnected yourself from the reality of what that harm actually looks like. Because cheering deportation isn't abstract. It means rooting for families to be torn apart. It means celebrating fear. It means siding with systems that would have happily done the same thing to your ancestors. And I need to be clear about this. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. This isn't about gravy versus sauce. It's about memory versus erasure. It's about whether we remember where we come from or whether we choose comfort over truth. Because we're living in a moment where forgetting is being rewarded, remembering is being framed as disruption. And I refuse that framing. When Italians forget where we started, how we started, who helped us, and it may not have been you, but your ancestors. So when you forget your history, you forget America's history. You forget the Black Americans' history. And you shape it into a caricature. And that is not what our history is supposed to be. So I'm setting a boundary here, out loud. I will always talk about food, language, tradition, and culture. But I'm not interested in using them as distractions from real harm or as shields against accountability. And if that makes people uncomfortable, so be it. Discomfort is not oppression. And memory is not an attack. We come from people who survived because they helped each other. We have a powerful voice culturally, historically, morally. And instead of using it to punch down or root for cruelty dressed up as law and order, we should be using it to lift people up, to help, to protect, to carry each other through the storm. That's how you tell the story without losing yourself. I know this episode was heavy, but it was also honest. And honesty matters, especially when it's uncomfortable. We don't honor our history by sanitizing it. We honor it by remembering it fully. If this conversation challenged you, sit with that. If it affirmed something you already felt, hold on to it. Either way, thank you for being here with me. I'll see you next Sunday. Pull up a chair. I saved you a seat.